So anyway, I want to welcome everyone to Belvedere Tiburon Library. My name is Milos Petrovic. I'm the program director here. If you have any ideas, suggestions, hopefully no complaints, but even I accept those. I'm the person to speak to when it comes to adult events here, more particularly the speaker series in the evening. We have great events coming up. If you're a local resident, but even if you're not, we have this newsletter that's been mailed to every household in Tiburon, Strawberry, and Belvedere. But if you don't have it, pick it up on your way out, because that's where a lot of our events are listed. We have something going on pretty much almost every night. We have something going on tomorrow night and the night after that. We had a great comedy night this last weekend. We have a prominent artist who will speak tomorrow at 6 o'clock. A really celebrated local Bay Area realist painter who will talk about his career. So that's something to maybe come to. You're not coming?
No, it's just
There is any painting already showing?
Not his paintings. So we have new paintings in the gallery. So that's a new exhibit now that'll be here for 2 months. But the paintings of this particular painter are not there. But he's local. He actually lives in Tiburon, and he's been a Bay Area, a local Bay Area painter. I mean, since the '60s, and has great following. And he's represented by a very prestigious gallery in San Francisco. And so it's quite an honor to have him here. He'll talk about his work, his creative process, and he'll show slides and stuff like that.
Did you say he's a realist? Did I hear you say?
A realist, yes. Have you ever seen Gerhard Richter, the painter? There was a big exhibit of his work just maybe a few years before COVID at MoMA in San Francisco. His work looks so real that it looks like it's photographed. It's not a painting. So the artist who will talk here tomorrow is one of those people who you can't believe that that's actually a painting. He doesn't even call himself an artist or a painter. He just says, I just copy things. He just copies reality, but he does it in such a beautiful, beautiful, poetic way. So it'll be interesting. Great guy. But anyway, moving on to Mark Sutton tonight, we have to also we can't just live in a little bubble and pretend like there's no reality around us, which is political reality. And some of us do try to avoid that reality, of course, at any cost, because it's stressful. But one really interesting thing about not just politics, but I think American society in general in the last few decades has been the decline of men in some way. I mean, boys, men, young adults, older men, especially, maybe not so much on the coast, but especially in the sort of the Midwest and blue collar environments. The role of men in society has changed, seems to have changed so drastically over the last few decades, from the height of, the way you imagine it in movies in the 1950s, when, the father figure, the grandfather figure, the young man, the James Dean, it had such prominence, and then it seems like it's just declined, and apparently it's had some consequences in our political life as well. And I think we're really fortunate to have somebody like Mark, who's actually studied this process and looked into what's going on, what's been happening, and to see what the consequences, what the reasons for it, what the consequences of that are, what can change, what it tells us about our society, about our politics. So on that note, I think I've said enough for tonight. Please help me welcome Mark Sutton.
Thank you, George, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, everyone, for coming out here tonight and spending your evening here. And yeah, you have some great programming here, so I'm going to be coming back as a listener as well. So thank you for that. So yeah, the topic of my talk tonight, I'm going to be exploring the gender gap in presidential voting. And just a quick introduction about myself. I graduated from a school called Presidio Graduate School here in the Bay Area. It was in San Francisco. It actually just moved up across the bay up here into Marin. And kind of like the library has to balance between speaking about politics or just speaking about stuff, I kind of do that too, because a lot of my work is with nonprofit organizations, and nonprofits tend not to be political. So, but some of the groups I've worked with, there's an organization called the Boys Initiative. They worked with boys and education. Another group called the Global Initiative for Boys and Men, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then there's also a new group that just got founded this year that I'm a founding member of called the California Fatherhood Council. So that's a pretty neat organization that helps with fathers, particularly those who are navigating the child support system or unmarried fathers, making sure they can keep up with their kids and spend time with their kids and things like that. Part of my work with that, I'm a data analyst, so there will be some math today. It's not going to be too hard, but there will be a little bit of math, so just to warn you. I co-authored the first ever California and Colorado reports on the status of boys and men. So these types of reports have been done for women and girls, paid for by the state for a long time, which is great, which is fantastic. But we didn't have one for men and boys. Well, why don't we do one? So we just did those as a nonprofit. And then this year, it being such a political year and me caring about these issues, and whatever anyone's political identity is here, that's totally fine, but I like to just be transparent. Remember, I've been a registered Democrat for 35 years, and if you're in a different party, we can have a great conversation, that's just fine. But I've been frustrated by the lack of attention paid to men's issues, men's social issues within the party, and I see them losing elections because of it. So that's why I wrote the book. And so let's dig into the issue. Why should either political party care about men? Why should it matter? So there's multiple reasons. First thing is, if you care more about men and you get more of the votes, you're more likely to win the White House, Congress, Senate, and then that will influence the Supreme Court. So it's extremely important to get everyone's vote. And also, we're all interconnected. So policies that help everyone are going to help everyone, right? So as we'll see later in the talk, there's a lot of social issues that men and boys are dealing with. Milosh had a couple of good talking points at the top there, thank you. So we'll get into those. And also I think it's really important, I always mention this, a couple of things. Just when I talk about men, I'm talking about the most inclusive sense of the word. So I include all races, religions, ages, ability levels, income levels, etc. Members of the LGBTQIA+ community, all of that. And also, of course, this year, it's a remarkable election in that we have the possibility of the first ever female president. And one of the major issues, of course, that is being talked about is the issue of abortion, which is a very serious issue. And so that obviously affects women a lot and has motivated a lot of women. And it's very, can be, again, a controversial issue, so I'm not going to dive too deep into it. But again, as we care about men's and boys' issues in our politics, I just want to make 100% clear, I'll say this several times, of course we still care for everyone else. Women and girls are also still very important. I always just like to make that explicitly clear, just so there's no confusion. And along those lines, there's a great quote. So our Surgeon General, his name is Dr. Vivek Murthy, and he has been actually one of the leaders of recognizing the issues that men and boys are having. And he was asked about this, and he said, are you worried that people are going to react negatively to you supporting men and boys? And he said, I've noticed there's been resistance to acknowledging that from people who worry that we'll take attention away from the continuing effort to ensure that girls and young women can also progress and can close the equity gap for them. I would not choose between my son and my daughter, and I would not accept that as a choice that any of us should make. We've got to do both. And I just thought that was a really nice way to put it. Again, it's just the same concept of inclusivity, and I just want to make sure that that's really clear. So I'm going to talk about a couple social issues real quick, then we're going to dig into the election, and then I'm going to do a little deeper dive into some of the issues. So here's just kind of a really quick high-level thing. Men's life expectancy now trails that of women by 5.9 years. And so that's a pretty big difference. And in fact, over the last 10 years, that's increased by over a year. Part of that was due to COVID, because men are more likely to die from COVID, but there's other reasons too. Something called deaths of despair. Those are types of deaths that come from suicide, alcoholic liver disease, or opioid overdose. Those are considered deaths of despair. In the year 2022, in just 1 year, there were 130,000 of those types of deaths in the United States. That's more than twice the men that died in Vietnam, but just in 1 year. So that's a challenge, along with the loneliness epidemic, and those two things are kind of intertwined. I know a big issue is mass incarceration, or also known as the prison industrial complex. That's a big social issue, and 93% of the people in prison are male. And in education, men are falling behind. Only 40% of college students are male right now. So that's just a high level. And one other thing, sorry, I don't want to get too depressing here. I'll get to some fun numbers in a second, I promise. But one other thing I know that puts fear in the heart of every parent is like a school shooting, right? That's like the absolute nightmare scenario. And they did a study, the New York Times did a study of the last 172 mass shooters. 168 of them were male. So this is a gendered issue. Something is going on with our boys and young men. Why is this happening? And just this summer, just during this election season, we saw 2 instances of this. I mean, just the most famous ones when the first assassination attempt on the former President Trump, that was a young man who was like 19 or 20, I think, and he had planned it out, and he planned he was going to do something, and I guess he had looked at several different targets, and this is a young man who was troubled, so I think that was very sad. And same thing, we just had this shooting in Georgia, 14-year-old boy. He was born in 2010. I mean, I can remember 2010 like it was yesterday. It's not that long ago. What happened in our society that from 2010 till 2 weeks ago, this boy woke up and thought the best thing he could do was, go commit some horrific act. So these are the kind of things, gun control and mental health are part of that. And absolutely we need to focus on those. I think another part of that picture is focusing on male well-being, because it is so many young men and even boys who are doing this kind of stuff. Okay, now let's get into some of the election stuff. So, polling disclaimer, I'm going to talk about polls. Polls are really important because they are good indicators of what's going on in the election, right? It doesn't tell us everything, they're not perfect, so just keep in mind they're imperfect, they can fluctuate pretty rapidly, they vary a lot depending on who's doing them and what their methodology is. So you can have 2 polls taken the same week that are pretty widely divergent. And in the last 2 election cycles, all the major polls vastly underestimated Trump's support. Especially last time. In 2020, Biden was expected to get about 8.5% of the popular vote. He got 4.5%. It was supposed to be a landslide. It ended up being pretty close. So, with that, here's my first graph here. This is really kind of the foundation of a lot of the work that I have done. So this is using exit poll data. So again, a little bit imperfect numbers, but pretty good indication. This is how men and women have voted for president since 1972. Okay, so you can see the black line on the bottom, that's how men have voted, and then the dotted gray line on the top, that's how women have voted. And Democrat is up and Republican is down. So you can see the gray line has tended to go up, and the black line has tended to go down. You see this separation. That's the gender gap. That's what we call the gender gap in political voting. And kind of like Milos said, I think this kind of represents somewhat of a disconnect in our society. I think it's showing that there's some sort of a disconnect going on, that you have this very steady pattern. The pretty cool thing about this graph too, you can kind of see the history of presidential politics for the last 50 years. So if you look at 72, that was Richard Nixon. Look how much he won by. He won men and women both by about 25%. So it was, total landslide. Then Watergate happened. And it seems kind of quaint compared to the stuff going on now, doesn't it? It's like, oh. Anyway, Watergate was a very big deal in the 1970s. It kind of shocked everyone. Boom, everyone went to Carter, so we went from minus 25 to plus 5. For both men and women, we kind of voted the same. And then 1980 was a key year. 1980 was the year where this gap kind of started. That's the year Ronald Reagan became president for his first term. And you see that gap kind of keeps going. In 1992, you see it narrows. So that's the year that Bill Clinton won his first term. But there was a third-party candidate named Ross Perot. He got like almost 20% of the vote, and that changed the gap between the Democrats and Republicans because a lot of the votes were siphoned off. And then you can see it kind of generally sort of get bigger and bigger as we go. So that this set of data right here is kind of a foundation for where my work started. I plotted that graph out, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about and analyzing this data. It's kind of cool. So as I said, in 1980, that was that year that Reagan won. That was the first year of the gender gap. So this is a guy named Richard Worthland, who was Ronald Reagan's advisor for Reagan's whole career. You know, before he was governor, he became governor of California and became president. Very smart and interesting guy. And he said something very interesting. Let me grab this out of my book here. But the first thing he did was he coined the word gender gap. He's the one who is credited with inventing that term, which is pretty amazing. And he said, you know, I worked on this campaign and I realized there was a gender gap, and people always asked, why are we doing worse among women? But nobody ever asked why we were doing better among men. For 25 years, not a single reporter asked him that. And I thought that was really fascinating, and it kind of goes right to the heart of the thesis of my book. Like, yeah, why didn't they ever ask him that? That was fascinating. And then Judith Mann, for the Washington Post, she kind of first publicized that concept. And so she took Worthland's idea and started writing about it. And so she did a great job with that. I would say that she made a mistake. Leading up to the 1984 election, she said, I think there's a gender gap, and I think Democrats are going to get so many women that they're going to win, even if there's a gender gap for Republicans among men. And she was wrong. 1984 went very, very solidly for the Republicans. So I'm worried that that's the same mistake that happened in 2016. I'm worried that that could happen again this year. Again, whatever your political beliefs are is fine, but I'm just worried the Democrats are going to do that this year. And I also want to say something. The gender gap exists among all races of voters too. So it's fairly consistent within each race, even though certain races like black voters vote more Democrat. But there's still more women voting Democrat than men in that group. Same with Latinos, same with with white, all the different races. So that's also fascinating. Okay, 2 trivia questions, and the winners get a book. Okay, trivia question number 1. Are we ready? Which state, I was just talking about the 1984 election where Judith Mann said, I think Democrats are going to win, and then they didn't. They only won one state. Does anyone know which state it was? Free book for anyone who can guess.
Minnesota?
You got it, all right. There you go. What's your name?
Mark.
Mark, oh, great name too. Awesome, thank you. Congratulations, Mark.
Well, that's biased, you're from Minnesota.
Yeah, I think we have another Minnesotan in the house too.
I was thinking Minnesota before he said it.
Okay, well, there's going to be a second question, so keep your thinking cap on.
Also Minnesota?
What?
Are all your questions about Minnesota?
Yeah. Okay. So this is the in the 270 to win, or these different electoral maps. They're like half blue, half red, or the coast are blue and the interim. This is the map from 1984. I mean, look at this. It's just Minnesota and Washington, D.C. And now I'm a native of Minnesota, and we were so proud that our guy, Walter Mondale, was going to be president, or at least he was close, and then he just got crushed. It was deadly. Okay. Trivia question number 2. Thomas, this is your second chance. There was a Ronald Reagan slogan. We're talking about Reagan 1980. It was a Ronald Reagan slogan that's something that would resonate with people today. Does anyone know what his slogan was? He had several, but there's one that will resonate today.
Are you better off today than 4 years ago?
No, good. That's a good one, but that's not it.
There you go again, talking about raising taxes.
That's a good quote, but that's not the slogan I'm thinking of.
Jane Wyman was right.
That's good. Ella,
Open the page and move forward.
It's morning in America.
that's another good slogan. That's not the one. Last chance. Last chance. Those are all good answers. Here's the answer I was looking for. Let's make America great again. It wasn't make. So he had the word "let's" at the beginning, slightly different. But it's kind of interesting when Trump used this slogan and everyone thought, oh my gosh, this is like MAGA, it's this new thing. It's like, yeah, happy days are here again, let's make America great again. Like we've had slogans kind of like this. It wasn't that catchy to me. It's amazing how well it caught on though. You gotta give the guy credit for that. So, back to...
When are these guys referring to? What year do they want to go back to?
Yeah, good question. Good question. Good question. So here's one of my key ideas, going back to this graph here. So I put in a line right here at -8%. I'm calling this the magic line. Now, you might have heard of this guy named Dr. Alan Lichtman. He has his 13 keys to the election, and he predicts who's going to win. I have one key. One key is all I need. -8%, if the black diamond, that is the male voters, are at 8%, -8% or above. So that is to say, if the Democrats lose men by only 8% or do better than that, they have won the election every single time since 1972. If they've lost men by more than 8%, more than 8, they have lost the election. Or you can think of the opposite. The Republicans have won every time, they have won men by 9% or better. So that is Sutton's key. That is my key. Now, that's one of my findings from my data analysis here. Another thing that's very important, so now we're looking at just the male voters, so the same graph, which is the male half of it. Every time the Democrats are in power, so whoever is the party that won, that's indicated on the bottom line here. So every time the Democrats have been in power, they have lost among men the next election. They go down, all these downward arrows. And that's why in 2020, the Democrats don't really have much more room to go down. So if they don't change their pattern, it's going to be very tough to win. Not impossible. And again, I want to stress, I'm looking backwards when I say this -8%. This is what has happened in the past based on data that is also a little bit fuzzy. So this is not a hard and fast rule, but I think it's a good guide. I think it's something that's important to see. So then the question was, what are the Democrats doing to try to attract men, since now we see how vital it is for them to get male votes if they want to win? Well, this was, again, I'm a data analyst, okay, so I get a bunch of words. What do? I count them and make numbers out of them. But that's what I did. So in the 2024 Democratic Party platform, the word women is in there 82 times, the word men only 4 times. 3 of those are in a phrase, men and women, so there's only one. That last one is in a issue about how Trump had 3/4 of the judges that Trump hired were men. And so it's a legitimate issue. Like, yeah, we need more equity among our judges, but it wasn't a male-supportive issue. So essentially, in the entire Democratic platform, they're not addressing any of the men's issues, which I spoke a little bit earlier, and I'll speak more to them. So anyway, that's just something I noticed. And the question is, well, what are the Republicans doing? Well, their platform was about, I did that same number count, it was about 6 to 5. They didn't talk about gender issues nearly as much. But I will say this, Republicans are focusing on men at least a little bit. So just take 2 examples here. Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, he wrote a book called Manhood, The Masculine Values America Needs. And then Senator Marco Rubio did a couple things. He did this report called The State of the Working and Non-Working Man, just about how men, kind of like Milosh was saying at the beginning, how a lot of men aren't working. He also sponsored the Commission on the Status of Black Boys and Men in the Senate, so after the riots in Minneapolis. So what are things looking like this year? So there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that young men are voting more Republican. But as I have analyzed this for years, the only change is it's the young men, because the older and middle-aged men were already voting more Trump. And now this year, just that younger group has just sort of also slid in. But this is the first time we've seen numbers like this in the age 18 to 29 group. So again, these are polls. Poll numbers can change. They're not perfect. But this was, the New York Times CNN poll, which is a very respected poll that came out just a few weeks ago in August. So these numbers, we saw the -8, right? So 13, 13, 19, 12. What's the average? 14, 15, something like that. And of course, it all comes down to the swing states, right? So these are the 7 swing states, and it's looking like they're going to be the swing states again if you look at the numbers. And so a few things to look at here. So of the 7 swing states in 2020, the Democrats, all those ones in blue are the ones that Democrats won. And only North Carolina, that's the only one the Republicans won. But you can see, I did it, from Biden's perspective, among men, every single state went toward Republican, and among women, every single state went toward Democrat. So that same gender gap in voting, we saw it in every single state. Although interestingly, Arizona was pretty close, and I'm not sure why, but that's pretty interesting. But this updated table on November 6th this year, when we update this table with these numbers, that's going to really tell the story of who wins this election. So, and all these states right now are considered a toss-up, pretty much. I think Harris is doing well in Wisconsin in particular, but it's going to be very close. Now let's get some photos. Okay, done with the numbers for a bit. Thank you for getting through them. Here's some photos. So I saw this, speaking of Minnesota, so our governor, Tim Walz, is obviously the VP candidate. I remember when this picture came up of him in the orange vest, I had flashbacks to John Kerry in 2004. And then when I thought of that, I thought about Michael Dukakis in 1998. And I noticed one thing, the Democrats have tended to say, oh, we'll just put a macho image of our candidate out there. But they're not focused on the issues. It's just an image. It's just a photo op. And I don't think that has a real strong effect. And then I thought of who's done really well for the Democrats. Well, here's the 2 presidents who won 2 terms. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Bill Clinton, remember, he was on the Arsenio Hall show playing saxophone, and we just came across as a guy. And Barack Obama, amazing community organizer. So anyway, these are just images that stuck to me. I don't have a super strong point with that. Here's a few images from this year that really have stuck out to me. 3 images in this election that have stuck out to me. So this amazing image might be photo of the year. That's Harris at the DNC, her niece looking up at her. Amazing photo. Of course, this could be a historic election, which would be amazing, which would be awesome. Great photo, love it. And this is the other great moment at the DNC that I really like. Did you guys watch that? Did people watch the DNC here? They know what I'm talking about. There was a moment when, Tim Walz's son Gus stood up and he got super excited, but that's my dad, and this is them hugging on stage. It was just a real sweet moment, and it was a great, I think it just really humanized the whole campaign, and it was just a great moment. That was one of my favorite moments of the DNC. And then this is going to be a historic picture from this year. This is from, we talked about that. I remember watching this on TV, couldn't believe it, but this almost looks like a fake pose picture. I mean, I don't think it is, but it's so, if it looks like Iwo Jima or something like that, it's just remarkable. Anyway, interesting photo. And again, I said this before, I'll just get through this real quick. We're going to talk more about some of the men's social issues right now, and then we'll have time to get to your questions. But again, I just want to reiterate, because I always do this, we can support everyone, women and girls, people who are transgender, non-binary. It's not a zero-sum game. We can support multiple groups of people at the same time in very meaningful ways. In fact, that's what we should be doing. So, and also some people, do have the belief, well, men have always, all the presidents have been men, like men are in power. What do we need to worry about them? That's been described as the apex fallacy. I didn't come up with that term, but somebody came up with that. It's just to say, a lot of regular people on the street, your average Joe, is not the president. He doesn't necessarily have millions of dollars. There's a lot of men who we'll see in a second are having a lot of issues. So with that, let's go ahead and start to look at some of the social issues that I think are important. I touched on them briefly earlier, and we're kind of go through these kind of quickly. But this one slides a little long, but health, longevity, and healthcare. So we talked about the life expectancy gap of 5.9 years. Men are more likely to die of 14 out of the 15 most common causes of death. And also we see racial inequities. So race is unfortunately still a factor in our country as well. But just to give you an idea, an Asian American girl born in 2021 has a 24-year longer life expectancy than a American Indian, Alaskan, Hawaiian native boy born the same year. And that's the government term, that's why I use that term, because that's what they use. 24 years. So when you look at gender and race, that's 24 years.
Wow.
That's a staggering statistic, I think. Men are less likely to have health insurance. Sperm counts have declined globally by over 50% in the last 50 years. And this is something not just in the US, this is all over the country. In fact, there was an Israeli study that just went out last year that was saying it's over 60% now. It's getting, it's going faster and faster. They found plastics in, male body parts. Microplastics are, in our bodies. So this is, a challenge. Men were are more likely to die from COVID-19. And the difference was so drastic at one point, they did studies where they were giving men estrogen to see if that might make them survive from COVID-19. Because women it's a devastating disease for anyone who gets it, of course, but men were more likely to die, have been more likely to die. And then again, this last one is kind of about those deaths of despair I talked about earlier. And one of the other statistics when I was just looking stuff up, researching for my book, that 78% of murder victims are men. I thought it was going to be about 50-50, but it's not. Education, boys are more likely to drop out of high school. Only about 40% of college students are male. There's been a lot of good work studying the brain differences of boys and girls. There's some different opinions on this, but I think it's clear that boys and girls have some different learning styles, and if teachers understand that, they can teach better and boys can do better. And recess is important for everyone, not just boys, but girls too. A lot of schools just got rid of recess because they just couldn't handle it. And it's so important for kids to get up and play, get that blood running around, get the blood rushing around their brain and everything, and then come back in and they can sit down and focus. Economic issues and jobs. James Carville, the Raging Cajun, said, "It's the economy, stupid." Right? We all remember that, the classic line. But that's true, and that's going to be true of every election. Economy and economic issues is important for everyone, men and women, everyone. And as Milos said again, you got like several of my talking points tonight, Milos. Good job. But men, traditionally have been expected to be the breadwinner, and now we're seeing fewer well-paying jobs that don't require a college degree. So a lot of the coal jobs, the Rust Belt jobs, we're seeing a lot of those have gone away. So that is, and we also inflation, been a lot of inflation recently. Another big issue for men is fatherhood, equal shared parenting. I mentioned I'm a founding member of the California Fatherhood Council, but it's very well known. I've got a quote in my book from Barack Obama in 2008. When he was running for president on Father's Day, gave this Father's Day address. He said, "Of course, we all know the details, how important fathers are, and all the statistics." And he was already tired of reciting the statistics back in 2008, and here we are in 2024. And I think we still need to really understand this. But there is a national trend right now to what's called equal shared parenting, which simply means if there are two parents who don't live together, they co-parent the child roughly 50-50, as much as they can do. And study after study has shown that has the best outcomes. Of course, not every single case would be the best, but in general, all things being equal, that's the best thing. And a lot of, I've worked with a lot of men's groups over the years, and one thing I'll say is a lot of fathers who feel estranged from their kids and then still have to pay child support, or they don't get to see their kids, they feel very upset. They feel like they're just a wallet, they're just an ATM machine for their family, but they don't get to see them and have meaningful time, and it can be very devastating emotionally. I know there's the idea of the deadbeat dad, and there are some dads who who don't live up to their responsibilities. But there's a lot of dads who try to do their best. I didn't put this on the slide, but another issue with this is people who can't pay their child support, even if it's no fault of their own, they get their driver's license revoked and they can even get sent to jail. And it's like, we got rid of debtors' prisons a long time ago, and so we still have debtors' prison in this country for parents who can't pay child support, which typically ends up being men, although it could be, theoretically, it could be anyone. Homelessness is a huge issue in the Bay Area. We all see this, especially if you're in San Francisco or Oakland or certain other parts. But homelessness is, again, it can affect anyone, but about 70% of the unsheltered homeless are male. So again, this is some of these issues. When I say, what is a male social issue? It can be something that exclusively affects men, like maybe like prostate cancer, of course, would only affect men, or it can be something that affects everyone, but affects a lot of men. So it's, you know, and so this is one of those where it can affect, of course, anyone can be homeless, but it turns out that there are more unsheltered homeless men. This is one, I don't know if anyone's seen that show, Baby Reindeer. Kind of got popular this year. Anyway, it was a show about a man who's being stalked by his ex-girlfriend, and it's very scary. Actually, I couldn't watch it. I started to watch it. It was a little too intense for me. But I've worked, again, with domestic violence groups, and there's a lot of men who have been, you know, victims of domestic violence, and they feel like they're invisible. Like the name of the act is the Violence Against Women Act. I said, what about me? Like I have a friend who got put into intensive care for 2 months and came out and they said, where's your child support payment? Like, what? I just got put in intensive care. And he's been featured in books and stuff like that. Like, his story was extraordinary. But anyway, I think the important thing is just like, we're all human. Things can happen to anyone. And we just need to understand there are male victims of domestic violence out there. It's just important to recognize that. Title IX, I could write a whole book about this. It's a very complicated one. But just to remind everyone what Title IX is, it was passed in 1972. It was part of the educational amendments to the 1964 Civil Rights Act that said you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. And so Title IX simply says if you are a educational institution that gets any sort of federal funding, which would include student loans, so almost every single college or university, right, would fall under Title IX, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. So, first of all, there's a lot of programs and scholarships that were made for women only, but you actually can't do that. That's illegal. And people think, well, it's not such a big deal. Well, maybe in the 70s, you know, when this first came out, that made more sense. But right now, we only have 40% of the students in college are male. And then there's a lot of these programs that's then excluding them once they get there. There's also some due process issues with, you know, this issue gets pretty deep. There are a whole cottage industry of lawyers who are now working on Title IX cases because people have been accused of crimes without due process, and then they end up suing the school. So it's kind of a mess. On top of that, the regulations are super complicated. So just in the last 4 years, in 2020, when Betsy DeVos was the Secretary of Education, they put out a 2,000-page revision to the regulations. So Title IX itself is one sentence. Just the 2020 regulations was 2,000 pages. And then in 2024, the Biden administration put out theirs, which is 1,500 pages. So how do you expect a Title IX person who's working at a college or university to understand 3,500 pages of regulations? It's just gotten so complicated. So anyway, it's really challenging. I work with some different groups, but there's a group that works with people who've been falsely accused. And you know, of course, I wasn't there, but these are people who believe they were falsely accused, have evidence that they were falsely accused. It's resulted sometimes in kids committing suicide and things like that because of these tribunals. Anyway, this is a complicated issue. It's kind of deep. And of course, Title IX is a great thing. We don't want discrimination. We want, you know, people would think of it for women's sports, which was, you know, at first, that's what most people first think of Title IX, because there used to be a lot of male sports programs and not many for women, so this balanced it out, which is great. So again, a lot of things about Title IX are great. It's just there's a lot of devil and there's a lot of details. This is a big issue in this country, the issue of mass incarceration. Again, 93% of those who are incarcerated are male. We have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. It's disproportionately low-income men of color. and men who grew up in a household without significant father involvement. There's some great things going on. A little positive news, there's some great things going on in California with this, just up the road in San Quentin. They're renaming San Quentin Prison to San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. Our governor has actually done, I think, some real good work up there. They're doing training programs, work training programs for the incarcerated individuals. So there's some good there, but this is, a problem. And I think the way to think of it is we want to have low crime and low incarceration rate. You can't just say, oh, let's not call this a crime anymore, because we tried that here, was it Prop M or whatever, and then, our car's been broken into 2 or 3 times, and some of these types of crimes started proliferating because they weren't really considered crime anymore. So that's not exactly the answer either. But it's supporting well-being, which is why I get back to that concept of well-being that I talked about at the beginning. Governor Walz at the DNC talked about IVF and how he has a child named Hope because they had that child through IVF or some sort of assisted reproductive technology. So just a reminder that reproductive issues affect everyone. They're a family issue, and families have everyone in them. Abortion is obviously primarily a women's issue, of course, and that's a major issue of selection, as we said. But it affects men and it affects the family too. Again, it's also a family issue. There's another issue that's, again, another deep one, but paternal misidentification. So in many states, once that person's name is on a birth certificate, if it turns out it wasn't their kid, oh, I didn't know it wasn't my kid, they still have to pay child support for 21 years. So some people think that that's not fair. That's called paternity fraud or paternal misidentification. There's a lot of great support for women and girls. Just here in California, we have a California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls. That's the logo you see there. San Francisco has its own department on the status of women and girls, which is great. This is fantastic. It's awesome that we have these things. And a lot of these organizations were created like 40 or 50 years ago when gender issues were in a different spot than they are today. And so I think it would be great if we had started to have some more of these men's commissions, kind of like the California Fatherhood Council that I'm a founding member of. More commissions like that to support fathers and men and boys who are, need support. Okay, so back to the election. Who will win and how will the gender gap affect the outcome? So just a kind of quick recap here. We have Harris as the first possible woman president. We have the issue of abortion. This is motivating a lot of women to sign up, to get engaged, to do canvassing and phone banking, all of that. So we're going, we probably will see a record turnout overall this year, particularly among women. We might have the highest. I think Democrats might have the highest plus among women that they've ever had. We'll see. Men, however, are still leaning heavily Republican, as we saw from this graph. So it's really going to be very close, and that's why I use this graphic of the women pulling left and the men pulling right. Obviously, there's a lot of men on the left, women on the right, but that's the way it's leaning. And just one mathematical thing, and if anyone wants to talk about this later, I think I've shared enough data, but there's something that's kind of interesting that Democrats need to win among women by about 8% more than they lose men, because they need to win overall the election by about 4%. So that means they need to win women by 8% more than they lose men by. So if they lose men by 8, they need to win women by about 16. So anyway, that's just a back of the envelope calculation, but that's very important. That's because of the Electoral College. That's why that is. And also, we didn't even get into the House and the Senate. So that is also, all these issues apply equally to states and things like that. So with that, that's the end of my talk, but I'd love to field any questions and comments and feedback, and thank you for listening. All right, any questions? Yes?
I have, maybe we missed it, but what's the percentage of eligible voters for male as opposed to female?
Good question. So the question is, what is the difference in the number of eligible male or female voters? And so I have a chapter on that in my book, chapter 9. And one thing, because I was curious about that too, how come there's so many more women voting than men, right? That's another thing. So it turns out there are about 7 million more women of voting age than men of voting age, because I used to always think there would probably be the same number of boys and girls born, but it's actually not true. There are about 105 boys born to every 100 girls born. And boys die at a higher rate, starting at childbirth all the way through the end of life. At about age 40, it crosses over. So at about age 40, there's the same number of men and women. And as you get older, there are more and more women, and that's where the longevity gap, you really show it. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is, anyone who's incarcerated, or in many states, if you're a convicted felon, you can't vote. So that knocks a couple more million off, because there are a lot more male felons than female felons. And then among the voters who can't vote, women also vote a couple % more. So it's kind of a combination of all those things that leads to that number. But in 2020, there were about 10 million more female votes cast than male votes. That's a pretty big difference. Pretty big difference, yeah. Yeah, good question. All right, anything else? Yes?
How do campaign strategies differ when they try to target male versus female? And then is that more effective in a certain gender when they're trying to do campaign strategies, especially during this current election?
That's a very good question. It's something I pay attention to, how the campaigns do it. And, I have my thoughts on, how it should be done. Obviously, the Democrats have decided we're not going to directly focus on male. There was one on male voters. In 2020, it's interesting, there was one TV commercial, and it was very specifically geared at men, but it wasn't done by the Democratic Party. It was done by the Lincoln Project, which is, if you remember, the Lincoln Project is a group of anti-Trump former Republicans. And so they recognized the need for the Democratic Party to better appeal to men. So they put a bunch of money into a campaign to help, men. So it's interesting that they did it and the Democratic Party didn't. And as you saw by the Democratic Party platform, they have made an obvious decision. I think they think we do so well among women, we don't want to mess with that, so we don't want to say anything about men. And I think that's a mistake. I think they could just say, hey, support men on just some of the issues maybe were a little controversial. The non-controversial issues like men's health. Maybe we could start an office of men's health that try to help them live a little bit longer or something like that. The Republican campaign strategy versus men, they haven't been as I mentioned, their platform only uses the word women 6 times, the word men 5 times. They don't talk about it as much. But clearly, they announced that they had a marketing strategy toward young male voters, and they're spending $20 million getting on all the, they're going to UFC events. There are these kind of, young male podcasts that are kind of more conservative, and Trump is going on these YouTube shows and these podcast shows to try to appeal very specifically to young men, because that page I showed where it had the 4 different age groups, and then that young group is the one that changed this election. Republicans see that as one way that they can, make a big dent in the votes this year. So that's a very good question, and obviously there are certain issues that are more focused on gender, and certain ones that just are more general, like economy. But another interesting thing, and I talk about this in the book, Hillary Clinton, in 2016, she focused more on her gender. She leaned into it. One of her slogans is, "I'm with her," and she had the arrow pointing. And I've noticed that VP Harris has not been doing that. She's focusing more on the ideas, and she's just letting her identity, she's letting other people talk about her identity, but she is not as much. She talks a little bit, but she's not leaning into it in the same way that Hillary Clinton did. And I think that's a smart tactic. Because she's got so many great ideas, and those are the ideas that people really want to hear. So I'm glad that she's focusing on the ideas, which is good. So, good question.
Do you have the numbers among the young voters are changing since that August poll? Because I read today or yesterday that of the newly registered, young voters, I think it was 18 to 29, something like 70% were registered Democratic.
Cool. So that's a really good point. And so I think at the very beginning, before you walked in, I had a slide about polls, which is really important, and it says how fast they can change. And so that's a really good data point. In fact, I'm going to look that up afterward. Because that poll was 3 weeks ago. That's like ancient history in election terms, right? And that's why it's, again, polls are indicators of how things, like where the weather is at the moment. They can shift very quickly, and I think you're right. I think a combination of the debate, which I thought Harris performed very well at the debate. Most people, I think she, quote unquote, won the debate. And then the Taylor Swift announcement, so that was good. So I think between those two, you're probably right, more young voters. I'd be still curious to see, like, with the young male voters, was that more young women or was it young men who are signing up? But that's a good question.
What do you think about the Taylor Swift endorsement? Because I've heard, I did read an article that said it's gonna backfire. I can't remember, I think it was like CNN, so I don't know, how biased that might have been. But then I also heard somewhere that, some pollster thought it could actually lead to 4 or 5% increase for Democrats, which seems shockingly high.
4 or 5% sounds really high. Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I haven't seen the data on that. You know, my gut would tell me it can't hurt. It certainly, I mean, it probably would motivate a few people who might not vote otherwise to say, you know, I really should vote. You know, and when the election is this close, I mean, you saw those 7 states. And the polling right now, I didn't put it up there, but it's very close. I think Wisconsin is the one state where Harris has a little bit of a stronger lead. And again, some of the polls vary on this a little bit, but they're all generally very close. So if you can get 1%, if that endorsement went 1% in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan or something like that, I mean, that could, at this point, any little thing can have an influence. I would say it was important. I thought it was so strange when there was that obviously fake graphic that she supported Trump, and he said, I accept. I was like, really? Like, of course that was fake. Anyway, that was kind of funny. But yeah, the celebrity endorsements, I think when it's this close, any little thing can definitely make a difference. So it's important, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what my question is here, but I just wanna vent a little bit, I guess.
Sure.
My concern is that, you know, the image, if you greatly oversimplify gender, people I think would say men are, and an adjective they might put to it are strong, strength. Women are compassionate. Those are both wonderful things. But what are people tending to look for in a president? They want strength. And you know, I even hear women, I've heard some women who are interviewed that would say, oh, I would never vote for a woman for president. I don't think a woman, you know, can do the right job, can stand up to the men in the world, you know, and it's like, oh my God. And so, I just worry a lot, you know. I mean, I'm so glad Kamala Harris, and I'm hesitant to say Kamala because I think that's sexist, to call the female candidate by her first name. It's very sweet, Hillary, Kamala, and it's always Trump, it's always Biden, you know, it's always, you know, it's male to use last names, it's very businesslike, it's very strong, it's very compassionate to use a first name. So even I'm falling into that when I talk about Kamala or Hillary. And I think that I don't know, I just feel like these are cultural imprints that maybe we've all got to a lesser or greater degree, and they greatly bias the outcome. And they will bias it, in this case, in terms of Trump. So I don't know what my question is, but I just want to say that. You can say, that's crazy, but.
No, that's a very good point. And it is interesting you say that there are some women who don't think a woman could be president. It's interesting. Obviously, Ms. Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1% in 2016. So still, majority of the voters thought that she could be president. But again, when it's so close, was there 1% who voted the other way for that reason? And that could have been enough to turn the election. So, you know, I think particularly more traditional voters might think that way, although maybe the more traditional voters would have voted Republican anyway, I'm not sure. But that's, very good points. Thank you for sharing that, yeah.
I'll echo that
Yeah.
I've actually called swing state voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan in the last 2 weeks. And I've heard from mostly seniors on that issue that they never thought they could vote for a female candidate for president. but in all these cases, they told me they were undecided because they don't like Trump's character, and they were having a very hard time deciding. And, you know, I was calling for Democrats. I tried to move the needle. I feel like I moved it a little bit, but, you know, they were having a very difficult time making that decision because they'd always seen leaders as men.
Interesting, yeah, interesting point. Thank you for sharing that. Any other questions or comments? Susan, yeah?
It seems to me a lot of it, though, should break down more according to the issues,
Mhm.
you know, as opposed to male or female. I mean, obviously, abortion is very much a personal issue for women, so that's gonna be, I think, yeah, women. But, you know, like climate change, maybe that breaks down more by age. I don't know, but was that part of what you've done in your book and your research?
So,
Also look at a breakdown by other factors, so looking at issues.
yeah, that's a really good point, and I think you're exactly right. What I try to do in my book, I'm kind of looking at a cross-section of those things, but always within the gender framework. That's just the focus of my book. Excuse me. But there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of ways to break down the election. You can splice and dice by, you know, age, income level, race, urban versus rural, education level, income level. You know, there's so many different ways to kind of splice and dice it. And you're exactly right. And in fact, there's a number of books this year that came out. As I was writing my book, I was keeping my eye on the bookshelf and saying, okay, who else is writing a book about the election? And I noticed that there is this genre that I'm now a part of, which is, here's what the Democrats should do for this particular group of voters. And so I wrote the one about, here's what Democrats should do for men. And somebody else wrote one, here's what Democrats should do for rural voters. And somebody else wrote one, here's what Democrats should do for working class voters. And so there's this kind of subset of books. And I think it's such a wide category and there's so much content. It's like you kind of have to pick part of it. And you could do young voters, like you could do age segments. And so I do a little cross-section of that. And but it's a good question. Like, I think climate change might be something younger people worry more about. I think you're probably right.
Can I ask then, what drove you to just, focus on gender?
So yeah, I have been.
Maybe I missed that.
That's okay. No, that's okay. It's just been an area of mine. I've worked with a lot of nonprofits that focus on male well-being. So I've worked with an organization called the Boys Initiative that worked with boys and education. The Global Initiative for Boys and Men that looks at data and well-being of boys and men around the country. And then the newly formed California Fatherhood Council, of which I'm a founding member, that's working with fathers, particularly those working with DCSS, Department of Child Support Services, and helping them navigate that and being able to spend time with their kids. So I'm very passionate about male well-being, and then I see the Democratic Party not talking about any of those issues whatsoever in their platform. And I just felt this urge, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna dig into this. This is bothering me, so I'm gonna lean into it and write a book about it. Yeah.
Mark, I have a hypothetical for you. We're less than 2 months away from the election. Like, VP Harris, the Harris campaign calls you tonight and says, Mark, can you fly out to DC or some swing state and advise us on how to win that and tip the scales towards men in this election? Like, what would you advise her campaign to do?
Well, if that call comes, that would be exciting. I don't think so. Yeah, with the Harris campaign call me. But what would I do if I were given the keys to the Cadillac and say, okay, Mark, we're going to give you some free reign, what would you do? I would, and I wrote this last year. I also have a blog, by the way, called Men in the 2024 Election, where I kind of follow these issues in real time and like what's going on in the different elections. But I wrote last year, in November, I think it was my very first blog post, says if I were the Democrats, I would go to the 7 swing states and I would start marketing to men yesterday. Like, they were already behind. They were minus 17 among men last November. And I said they need to market to men in the 7 swing states, and they need to engage with them, ask them what their issues are, learn from them, and work with them to create the platform, get some of those people on their platform committee and include those issues in the platform and put that in their campaign messaging like all year. And they did the opposite. So they just didn't do it. Like, if you listen to Biden's State of the Union address, didn't mention any men stuff. He looked at his budget, he didn't mention men at all, the entire budget. And so if I were to be called now, I'd say, first of all, you're a little late. But last second, like 2-minute warning, like timeout, huddle, like what are we going to do? I just start messaging to men directly, like that Lincoln Project had in 2020. Hey, men, you know, you can vote for Harris and Walz. They're great. And I think they're doing something very smart. I think the Democrats this year, I think they learned from previous elections, but they're marketing really heavily in those 7 states. They're on the ground. They're going to rural areas as well as urban areas. They're kind of really trying to get everyone. So I think they're doing a lot of things right. I did speak with the head of the North Carolina Democratic. That's one of the highest people I actually spoke with. And you know, I said, "What is your strategy for men in your state?" She said, "We don't have one." I said, "You need a strategy." I said, "I would suggest. I'm not an experienced campaign person. I don't profess to be. I'm an engaged voter, engaged citizen. Involved with neighborhood groups. I've been the vice president of my neighborhood association. Yeah, that's about as high up as I've ever been. But I would say you need a strategy because, as the numbers show, you can only do so well among women before, if you lose more among men, you're going to still lose the state." And she gave a talk, and one of the things she said is, "Our party is a party for anyone who's not a straight white male." I thought, well, you just alienated 33% of the voters with that statement. I think the better way to phrase it would be, we're the party that supports everyone regardless of identity. That's everyone, right? So that's the sort of thing they can do. Also on the website, the Democratic Party website, say, here are the groups of people we serve. Women, girls, of course, there are different other groups. There's no men and boys. So it's like, well, if you're going to do women and girls, do a men and boys one. It doesn't cost a cent. And maybe a few, how is that going to completely turn the needle at this point, or turn the dial at this point? Maybe not, but just start being more equal in messaging, just to get a little more balanced in the messaging. And I think if they did that, at least it wouldn't hurt, it could help. And then the direct outreach to men in those areas would be the other thing. And also, sorry, one more thing. The information I would share with them, there was a great article that came out on this just yesterday, I just saw this, but somebody did a great study of male social outcomes in red states versus blue states, and they found out that men have better outcomes in the states run by Democrats. So use that in the red states, say, hey men, in red states, the men in blue states are doing better than you. Don't you want to have better outcomes like they do? And that might convince people too. So there's a lot of things that they could do in terms of messaging that might help.
But it seems to me that the things you're talking about are more cosmetic, the solutions, more kind of outreach marketing, getting them out to vote, reaching them and stuff, and you're not addressing the root cause. It seems more short term, as opposed to, it doesn't tackle in any way any of the statistics, the grim statistics that you showed us at the beginning of your talk, which showed that men committed suicides, that men were in prison, men were homeless, fewer men were in college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, died earlier, lived shorter lives. So it seems to me that, yes, maybe if you were called now to help Democrats now for November, you could say, listen, I can't address any of the big issues, we can only do cosmetic stuff and marketing. But long term, if you're looking for elections for 2040 or down the road, you would say a responsible policy of any party would be, especially in this case, apparently the Democratic Party, would be to address these deep structural differences that account for the gender gap in the first place, and to ameliorate the situation there.
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. For longer term, I talk about this in my book, like think forward the next 2 decades. If Democrats can get that slope of that black line of the male voters to go up, they'll have a much more likely chance to win the White House, Congress, and then therefore the Supreme Court. And you're exactly right. They need to have long-term institutional type solutions. So like off the top of my head, just the most obvious one that I think is not very controversial would be an Office of Male Health and Well-Being. And in fact, one was brought up in Congress 2 years ago by Representative Payne from New Jersey. And he did it because his dad had died at a young age. And so he wanted to do this, increase prostate cancer screening, all sorts of stuff for men. And then sadly, and so he put forth this bill. He did get together a congressional men's health caucus, which is actually pretty impressive. It's got about 45 members. So there's some progress being made, at least on that front. And then sadly, the bill didn't go anywhere. President Biden, didn't support it, never mentioned it, didn't talk about it. And then last spring, unfortunately, Representative Payne himself passed away at the age of 65. So fairly young, 65. So that was very sad, but I think call it the Representative Payne Office of Men's Health, name it after him. Show his picture and show all the valiant work that he did and celebrate it and rally people around that. It just seems like a thing that I think both parties could get behind. And that's another thing. I mean, a lot of these issues I don't really think are partisan. I think a lot of these things are really nonpartisan, and so the Democrats can get behind them. I think it's only going to help them. I don't think it's going to hurt them. There's certain of the issues maybe are a little bit more controversial, but I mean, there's so many that aren't. There's so many that are just help boys not drop out of school. Let's do some sort of boys mentoring program. I think most people would be okay with that. But yeah, good question. There's some of those bigger policy issues, and that's what I was mentioning about, in that article from yesterday, lower cancer rates, higher longevity, better marital outcomes, fewer divorces in blue states than in red states, different things like that.
So, just a follow-up question. How do you explain the fact that Democratic party platform mentions women 82 times, men only 4 times? Are they so blinded by a certain kind of woke ideology and okay, we gotta have these catchphrases, catchwords, catch terms, whatever? I always thought that these campaigns are run by people who are really mathematical about it, ruthlessly statistical, mathematical, driven by percentages, numbers, graphs, and you do what it takes to win. And so to have such disproportionate numbers, to push forward is the whole message about women. If statistics, if what you're showing us is true, that it's the men who need to be reached. I mean, there's obviously a disconnect. Somebody's not doing their job within the Democratic Party.
It's funny you use the word disconnect. That's the exact concept I use in my book. I call it the democratic disconnect among men. And of course, as I mentioned before, and I'll say again, women and girls have a lot of issues, and we need to support everyone, and those who are transgender and non-binary. We want to support those people as well. We want to support everyone. But you're right, it's the men's issues that aren't getting addressed, and that's exactly what I call it, the democratic disconnect. And in fact, the strategy, going back to your strategy question, I am reminded of Howard Dean's, in 2006, he had the 50-state strategy. And the 50-state strategy was, we're going to support Democrats in Alabama and Mississippi and Wyoming, and we know that your president is not going to win the state, and you're probably going to win the Senate office there. But you know what? You might win a school board seat. You might win a local race in an area that used to be red, and we flipped it to blue. And we're going to support Democrats everywhere. And I think they should do the same thing, but instead of along geographic lines, along demographic lines. And I call it the all-demographic strategy. And I think they should say, we're going to support all people. We know we're not going to win among men, but if we get it up to -4 or -2, nationally, that's likely going to be a strong electoral victory for us. Plus, it's the right thing to do to support everyone. So I really think they should support all demographics, and I think they can do a much better job of supporting men. Any other questions? Or are we good? All right, well, I want to thank everyone for coming out today. Thank you, Milos, for having me, and everyone have a good evening.
My pleasure, and Mark has some copies of his book that he's happy to sign for you and inscribe with a special customized inscription, and you even get a little sticker on it, right? The sticker. So anyway, thank you so much for coming again. Please do come back. Yes, well, I know you two do, but I have seen some faces that I'd love to see again here because we have some amazing, amazing programs coming up. So please, please, please come back and spread the word. Yeah. Thank you.